Good afternoon, everybody. I hope your semester's off to a great start. This is the first in a series of mini lectures I'm going to be doing throughout the semester to kind of help you synthesize the ideas that you're encountering in the readings and the images that I post on Canvas. And the intent of these is really to kind of help you make connections between different texts and also to look at some specific instances of writing that might be helpful for you to think about as you move forward, both with your own writing and with the readings that we're going to be doing. Okay, so today we're mainly going to be thinking about this David Sedaris essay, Us and Them, connecting it to the Frederick Douglass section that I assigned from his memoir or autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And in order to help us kind of think through some of the issues, I wanted to bring in some art by Edward Hopper and Arne Svensson, and also a couple of cultural theorists, Herbert Marcuse and Christopher Lasch. And then we'll also kind of bookend the conversation by looking at two literary critics that I really admire, David Foster Wallace and Michael Wood. Um, so maybe we can jump off by let's just review the let me share my screen here. Hmm. Okay. So these are the writers we're going to look at today here in the chat. Um, and I can get that out of the way. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So I posted this. This is my discussion wrap up from discussion number one. If you haven't read through that on Canvas, I would encourage you to do so. I won't go through all of it here, but I just wanted to highlight a few things that you all noticed in the essay. I thought you made some great observations. And I would say like three key themes emerged from that conversation. First of all, Sedaris's youthful narrator seems very concerned with the idea of normalcy, right? So for him, his family is normal, and he establishes this opinion based mostly on the fact that they watch television, right? And by contrast, the Tomkeys are viewed as abnormal or weird or eccentric, primarily because they don't watch television. They also do different things that are strange, like showing up for Halloween on November 1st instead of trick-or-treating on the 31st. But the kind of central node of normalcy for the narrator seems to be sort of thinking about one's life as mediated through television. Okay. And we're going to look at some instances of mediation, um, and see how that plays out in different art forms, including the film Network and the work of Edward Hopper and the photographer Arne Svensson. And what is mediation, first of all? Well, mediation is just the idea that we have direct experiences in life, right? Like if I knock on wood, as the saying goes. But there are other experiences that come to us through various channels, right? So the smartphone, the internet, the radio, television, cinema, etc. These are all different media which bring experiences to us, um, but they're different from the experiences we encounter in the world, right? And all of these artists are kind of thinking about the place that different media have in our lives. And certainly for Douglas, he is obsessed with getting access to language or he has language, but he doesn't have the ability to read and write when he's a young boy. And for him, gaining those abilities is key to his development of self, right? Um, Sedaris's narrator is in a sort of different situation. He's got media all around him. Rather than having a deficit of media, he has a lot of it coming at him, right? And the first writer we're gonna look at is David Foster Wallace, who in his essay E Unibus Plurum describes the extremely central role that television played especially for fiction writers in the 80s and 90s, or generally you could expand that to the post-World War II era. Okay, so um, Sedaris ties the idea of being normal to the media one consumes. Many of you noted that this character is kind of gossipy, right? Um, he's really fixated on the Tom Keys. Some of you may have been reminded of Boo Radley, the character. Okay, we're back. So Boo Radley is a character in a Harper Lee novel called To Kill a Mockingbird. You may have read it in high school. Um, and in To Kill a Mockingbird, there are um, two children named Scout and Jem who live in a neighborhood in the South. And they are kind of fixated on one of their neighbors whose name is Boo Radley. Now, Boo Radley is a shut-in who never really comes outside. And as the children explore the neighborhood, they kind of dare one another to go, knock on the door, kind of playing ding dong ditch type of a thing. And in this subplot of the novel, we see that the children's attention really sort of swirls around this mysterious figure. And in a similar way, Sidaris's narrator becomes a little bit obsessed with the Tomkeys, and he experiences this initially as a kind of charitable act. He sort of grants them the gift of his curiosity about them. And later in the essay, this curiosity turns into pity and then even hatred, right? So there's a kind of suggestion here that our curiosity about others can be a kind of double-edged sword, right? It's both the means by which we kind of go out into the world and encounter new people and new experiences, but it also can have there can be problems associated with our own curiosity, and some of the artists we're going to look at will explore that idea, right? Um, we there's the image of the peeping Tom that comes up certainly in To Kill a Mockingbird, but also in the work of Arne Svensson. The idea that observing people can be an invasion of privacy at times. It's interesting to look at the paintings of Edward Hopper from that perspective, and I'll show you some of those images later in this lecture. Um, Lydia Davis, in her very short story about trying to imagine how she would look to a neighbor, I find really fascinating because it kind of complicates our idea of self, right? Like we may think that we kind of produce our own personalities, but Davis reminds us that we're also always kind of imagining how we're being viewed from the outside, either by other people or by the lens of a camera um, or by social systems, right? And Herbert Marcuse is going to talk about his concept of the one-dimensional man, who, and very related to the poem "The Unknown Citizen" that I posted, where one way we might think of ourselves is how do we look to a bureaucracy, right? When you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, they have a certain view of you that probably has very little to do with your internal subjective experience of yourself. Okay. Um, the the trope of eavesdropping is really important in the Frederick Douglass reading. If we recall, he actually learns to read by kind of listening in on the reading and writing lessons that the the white boy is receiving from his family, right? And so for Douglas, eavesdropping gives him entry to culture, right? It's he's not concerned about this sort of violation of privacy or indeed violation of the law because enslaved blacks were not allowed to learn to read and write. And some of you brought that up in your commentary. Actually, for discussion two, people commented on that. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so let's start off by looking. Oh, one more thing. So pity. Um, Many of you kind of keyed in on this idea that the narrator's sense of pitying the Tomkeys is problematic. And we're gonna, when we look at Michael Wood toward the end of this lecture, we'll kind of think about the role that pity plays in our construction of our ideas of self and how we view the people around us. Okay, so let's turn to David Foster Wallace. Okay, so this is an essay called E Unibus Plurum, Television in U.S. Fiction. Um, the title here is kind of crafty. Wallace is taking the motto that's on the US dollar bill, pluribus unum, which means from many to one, and he's flipping it. So this sort of means something like from one to many. And a lot of people have read this title as signifying Wallace's belief that um, the United States in this postmodern period, let's say after the 1960s, has become very fragmented, and there's less and less sense of community and solidarity, right? And we can think about this with reference to the world of Sedaris's neighborhood, where on one hand, he's living in a kind of a middle-class suburban community, and he's got neighbors, and they seem nice, but he's not viewing his relationship to society as primarily one about relations with real people, right? His mother makes excuses to not make friends with people. The mother figure here is, I think, very fascinating, and the child sort of takes that as an excuse to stay disconnected from people. And what he replaces connection with would be a kind of um, ogling mentality, right? He's very observational and has an intense interest in people, but it doesn't seem to involve a lot of actual getting to know them, right? Now, Wallace tackles this problem um, specifically in the context of people who write. Okay, so he says fiction writers as a species tend to be oglers. They tend to lurk and to stare. The minute fiction writers stop moving, they start lurking and stare. They're born watchers. They're viewers. They're the ones on the subway about whose nonchalant stare there's something creepy somehow, almost predatory. This is because human situations are writers' food. Fiction writers watch other humans sort of the way gapers slow down for car wrecks. They covet a vision of themselves as witnesses. Okay. But fiction writers as a species also tend to be terribly self-conscious, even by US standards. Devoting lots of productive time to studying closely how people come across to them, fiction writers also spend lots of less productive time wondering nervously how they come across to other people, how they appear, how they seem. Whether their shirt tail might be hanging out their fly, whether there's maybe lipstick on their teeth, whether the people they're ogling can maybe size them up as somehow creepy, lurkers and starers. Okay. Now, this brings us to Edward Hopper, who's a mid-century American painter. The image that you would probably be most familiar with would be nighthawks. Um, Let me zoom ahead to that one. This is one of the most famous American paintings, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Mhm. Okay, so this one is called 11 a.m. And notice here few elements. It's interesting to think about the perspective that the viewer is viewing this image from, right? So we have access to this kind of intimate, what looks like a probably a small apartment in a tall apartment building. So there's some evidence that we're in a city here. But the woman is naked, and her posture this is very typical in Hopper figures. There's a certain resignation to her posture. She seems to be perhaps zoning out, perhaps contemplating things. Um, at the same time, there's an interesting contrast between her nudity and the fact that the curtains are open and the window seems to be wide open. There's a certain lack of self-consciousness um, that is maybe a little different than what Wallace was just describing in the previous excerpt I showed you, where Wallace really connects our our instinct to watch other people with um, a kind of reverse sense that we are being watched. And at least in this image, I don't seem to see that anxiety in this woman. Another example here would be hotel room. Part of what I love about Hopper is that it really reminds us of there seems to be a lot of boredom in these paintings. We typically will have one, two, maybe sometimes three or four figures who are generally busy doing not a lot. This woman seems to be reading here on the side of her bed. It's a kind of a quiet moment. Um, but the walls are bare. We don't see a television. So there's Hopper kind of reminds us of the media environment of he starts out in the 1920s and he's kind of active up through the early 60s. But many of his paintings kind of harken back to this time in which you were not being constantly bombarded with media and you had to make more of a conscious choice to do something like open a physical book. This one's called Hotel Room. Okay, this is Cape Cod morning. We have a woman looking out a window, presumably, and this brings up again the question of windows as media themselves, right? So whereas now our lives are full of screens and we access a lot of our experience through screens, in a kind of pre media saturated world, the screens people were looking for were like literal looking through would have been, the plate glass of a window or a screen on a window or a door. This woman has a more alert, expectant posture and look on her face, and it kind of causes us to wonder, is something approaching the house? Is she looking at a storm cloud gathering? But yeah, this is very typical of Hopper's figures who are kind of, on one hand, seem isolated and disconnected, but on the other hand, seem interested in what's going on through the window. Now, this is Nighthawks. We have a kind of a diner scene at night. What many people remark upon here is the kind of sense of disconnection between this figure in the center and these figures over here. The man's posture also, he seems, again, we get this sense of resignation. There is a kind of perhaps loneliness that people have read into this scene. Over here on the left side, there's nobody on the streets. There are very clean lines. And for me, it's a kind of very dreamy, almost sepia tinged image that captures something very real about urban life. There's the famous quote. Oh, I can't remember who said this. That was it. Greta Garbo said she loved living in New York because it was the only place she could feel alone, right? And so there's this interesting notion that urban environments provide a certain anonymity because there's so many people that you can't get to know them all, and you're not going to bother starting a conversation with someone at a diner or on the subway or what have you. And it's interesting to contrast that with the world that Sedaris is describing, where he does have neighbors, he does know them, they do seem friendly. And yet, because he is sort of choosing to focus his experience on mediated um, messages coming through the television, he still feels a sense of disconnection. Okay. Now, night windows, I selected this image because this sort of raises um, the sort of potential for trouble that can arise when we are looking at people in their private moments. And this is something that Svensson explores in a really interesting way. Here we have a woman in an apartment. It looks like her window's open and the curtain is blowing out. She's bent over. We have her backside kind of occupies the central part of the image. And Svensson, I have to imagine he's thinking of Hopper in his photographs because I suppose one of the issues that comes up here is when you're observing other people, and they may be sometimes in unflattering positions or having private moments, there's an ethical question of, do we have a right to be doing that? How much attention is healthy, and then does it ever cross a line into kind of invading someone's privacy or not allowing them to present themselves to the world in the way in which they would like? Okay, so now we get to Arne Svensson. This is a series called The Neighbors that caused a really big controversy in the art world because what he did is he was living in a an apartment building on a high floor, and he had inherited a telephoto lens, right? So it could zoom in and capture images that were quite far away. And so he started taking pictures of his neighbors who were living in the apartment building across the street from him. But of course, these people had no idea that they were the subjects of his photos. And one of the people who appears in the photos actually sued Arne Svensson. And the in the lecture that I posted to Canvas, in which he describes the experience of going through that, he talks about how, well, one thing he says about this particular image is that this is the only child that appears in his work or in this series, because of course, there's something maybe more sensitive about capturing images of minors without their parents allowing it. Um, but he got sued, and what he describes in that lecture is, ironically, the negative attention to this exhibition actually made the photographs sell really well. And so all the money that he was taking in from selling the images, he was then sending to lawyers to try to defend himself against these lawsuits. Um, we're going to look at a Renaissance painting in a few slides, but this one to me is very evocative of Renaissance art from Europe. It's a little bit evocative of images of the body of Christ after he's crucified with the kind of limp arms and the exposed neck. I think it's a very beautiful image, very artful, right? So even though he's capturing this moment that's just a kind of a moment in time that wasn't planned, it sort of almost looks like it's been beautifully staged. Okay. Okay, now this one, Neighbors number 5, looks to be maybe a woman perhaps scrubbing a floor or doing something down on her hands and knees. Again, we get the image from behind. I think most people, if asked, how do you want to be photographed, probably wouldn't choose this posture. Um, and so, and yet this is a very common image in art. There's many, I'll post to Canvas some other examples of, people at work, were a big part of Renaissance art, kind of, looking at regular people. There's a famous painting, The Reapers, of just men in a field, cutting hay. Um, so yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting one. Now, I believe this is the person who actually sued Arne Svensson. Again, we get this sort of image of a person who's being captured without their knowledge. To me, it's also beautiful. There's a certain like restfulness of someone taking a nap on a couch. Um, the the sort of the regular clothes he's wearing, this feels like a very everyday experience, but also that the photographer has captured something kind of peaceful and beautiful at the same time. Okay, now this image on the left, the neighbor's number 14, a woman, presumably she's just gotten out of the shower. She's got a towel wrapping up her hair. Um, to me, this is very reminiscent of the Vermeer painting, Girl with a Pearl Earring. where we're kind of seeing a character over the shoulder. Vermeer's figure is looking back at us, so this suggests that she has a kind of an awareness that she's being observed, whereas Svensson's character does not. It also looks like this character might be on a cell phone to me. Um, and so I like looking at these two images next to one another because it raises a question, what are you missing in real life or in unmediated experience when you're on your cell phone, right? Whereas this figure on the right, she's aware, she seems to be locking eyes with the observer. Okay. All right. Now, many of you noted in the Sedaris essay, Us and Them, that the narrator is an interesting kid. And actually, I'm fascinated by this issue of like, do we think of him as a child or do we think of him as the adult writer who is thinking back on his own childhood? And at times in the essay, it seems to kind of vacillate between those two modes, right? So, in some sense, it's as if the adult writer, David Sedaris, is outing himself as a kind of insufferable little kid, right? And there were a few comments surmising that the child seems sort of arrogant, perhaps a little narcissistic, a little self involved. And so I wanted to bring in Christopher Lasch because I think he's very helpful in thinking about the rise of narcissism in modern industrialized societies that really seem to take off in the post-World War II era, right? And so in the culture of narcissism, American life in an age of diminishing expectations, Christopher Lasch writes the following. The mass media, with their cult of celebrity and their attempt to surround it with glamour and excitement, have made Americans a nation of fans, moviegoers. The media gives substance to and thus intensify narcissistic dreams of fame and glory, encourage the common man to identify himself with the stars and to hate the herd, and to make it more and more difficult for him to accept the banality of everyday existence. Now, banality means the sort of normalcy or non-spectacularness of everyday existence. Hannah Arendt, in her famous study of the Holocaust, in which she tried to investigate why did everyday, presumably normal Germans go along with the incarceration and mass killings of so many Jews and other people. Um, her book is called The Banality of Evil, and she hypothesizes that the perpetrators of these crimes were not necessarily supervillains in the way that we might have expected them to be, but that actually a lot of regular people were willing to go along with very you know horrendous crimes, right? And this was a very disturbing theory to a lot of people because it suggested that we could, that societies are maybe not as stable or as good as we would like to think. Few things I'd like to point out here. So Lash starts out, he's connecting mass media to narcissism. And we might sort of wonder, because I don't think that's an obvious connection, right? But how is it that over investing in things like television shows, cinema, in today's world, we might say TikTok or Instagram, how does this produce a kind of narcissistic self-involvement? Well, Lash theorizes that part of what it does is it makes us identify with sort of extreme experiences. If we're on Instagram all the time, we might develop an expectation that everyone should be beautiful and constantly on vacation, et cetera. And that this, on one hand, maybe there's nothing wrong with a little bit of indulgence of fantasy, but the problem for Lash is that it makes people hate the herd. It makes people kind of not appreciate regular everyday people. And I think we see this in Sedaris's narrator's relationship to the Tomkeys, right? That he sort of despises them in a way. I think partly because they choose not to participate in this mass media culture. Okay, another theorist that I think is relevant here would be Herbert Marcuse. He's from the Frankfurt School, a group of German philosophers and sociologists and cultural theorists who set about thinking through the effects of urbanization, modernization on the self. How does living in these highly developed, highly technologized societies sort of transform our relationships to each other, to the economy, to our own work, to our own sense of self, etc. And just wanted to go through a few quotes I pulled from this book. So Marcuse writes, most of the prevailing needs to relax, to have fun, to behave and consume in accordance with the advertisements, to love and hate what others love and hate, belong to this category of false needs. So here Marcuse introduces this concept of false needs, and he says that what media does is it produces desires in us that we may not have otherwise had. And then because we're in a capitalist society, those desires can only be fulfilled by buying things, right? Or maybe I shouldn't say only can be fulfilled, but the sort of most surefire way to fulfill these needs that have been implanted in us by messages from the media is to go out and buy a Corvette or go on vacation or what have you. Okay. Next, he asks, can one really distinguish between the mass media as instruments of information and entertainment and as agents of manipulation and indoctrination? So here he's asking a question that I don't think really occurs to the child uh, version of the narrator in Us and Them. This child seems to think that television just stands in for what is right and good in the world, right? And then if you don't connect with television, you'll just be lost, like the Tomkeys are from his point of view. But what Marcuse is asking us to do is to wonder, the television has to be paid for at this time through advertising, and advertisers are going to manipulate us into buying their products. And so it can be very hard to pull apart our enjoyment of the media. So if you tuned in to watch a sitcom like Seinfeld in the 90s, it was a very popular show. Everyone, or many people watch the show. We're often not really aware of how the commercials that are inserted into that show are influencing us. Okay, then finally, Marcuse makes the point that people need to recognize themselves in their commodities. And commodities would be things you can buy, right? They find their soul in their automobile, hi-fi set, that would be a stereo, split level home, kitchen equipment. The very mechanism which ties the individual to his society has changed, and social control is anchored in the new needs which it has produced. Okay, so let's think about this here. The mechanism which ties the individual to his society has changed. So what he means here is that in a um, previous epoch, your society would mostly be centered around your local community, your family, perhaps a church, perhaps a football club you belong to, various hobbies that you're involved in, of course, your working life that would be done mostly in person, not mediated through Zoom, right? And that the changes that came with mass urbanization and the hyper technologization of our lives have really changed our soul. Okay. And then he concludes by saying, no wonder then that in the most advanced areas of civilization, the social controls have been introjected to the point where even individual protest is affected at its roots. Now, introjection is an interesting key term here. Introjection is sort of the opposite of projection, right? So when we're Freud describes projection as a process whereby, let's say I'm lying to you and I have a kind of guilty conscience about that. If I'm projecting, I will accuse you of lying, right? It's sort of a way that we unburden ourselves of our usually kind of things we're not proud of by projecting them onto other people. Introjection is a kind of reverse process in which the values that are coming at us from society through media get adopted by us on an unconscious level, and we begin to sort of advocate for those values and adopt a lifestyle according to those values without ever having really thought through, like, do these values actually align with my own core beliefs? Okay. Um, the intellectual and emotional refusal to go along appears neurotic and impotent. This is the socio-psychological aspect of the political event that marks the contemporary period, the passing of the historical forces which, at the preceding stage of industrial society, seem to represent the possibility of new forms of existence. Okay, this is very dense. Frankfurt School writings tend to be very compact and use lots of terms. So I want to kind of open this up a little bit. What he's saying here is that the contemporary period that we live in, so he's talking about, basically from the 50s onward, um, is different. And this difference is marked by what? Okay, at the preceding stage of industrial society, so let's say before World War II, um, or you could go back to the Industrial Revolution, 1750 or thereabouts. We have the invention of the steam engine, the railroad, then we get the telegraph, radio, and there's a lot of excitement that this new technology is going to be able to allow us to interact and live in radically different ways, right? Including we may be able to sort of reimagine how our economies should work, how our relationship to power should work, et cetera. And Marcuse, who's very much a pessimist, the title here, One Dimensional Man, seems to suggest that we have lost important dimensions of ourselves, um, because we are kind of constantly being bombarded by mediatized messages that we are introjecting and taking on as essentially our personalities. Okay, so we now have on the table a handful of different diagnoses of problems that contemporary people are subject to. Wallace tells us that television makes us overinvest in watching, and it also makes us anxious about how we're being observed by others. Lash explains that our over investment in media can make us sort of narcissistic and self-involved and disconnected from other people. And Marcuse, in One Dimensional Man, um, links this to the economies, kind of pushing commodities on us as a replacement for more genuine experience or genuine connection with the people around us. So this raises a question, right? So if these three are correct in their diagnosis of the problem, is there any solution, right? And I want to show you one sort of thought experiment about what a solution might look like. And this is from the film Network from 1976, which centers on a television news broadcaster who is basically like the guy who comes on at 6 p.m. every evening and reads the news. Um, this is set in the 1970s, so this is prior to a really significant change that occurred in news media, um, in the last 20 years, 25 years or so. Um, and that change is that news media has become much more polarized now, right? So you'll have like Fox News on the right and MSNBC on the left, and many, many, many more places you can go to get your news, right? And many of them have a very specific political slant. And so if you kind of only get your news from one of those sources, you may end up in a kind of information silo, right? Where you're only hearing the news that those channels think you're going to want to hear. Network is set in an earlier time where you had these three main networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and they were still playing to a kind of broad audience, right? So they couldn't be too far in any direction because they were trying to kind of appeal to an audience of very mixed political leanings. However, in the story, our protagonist sort of starts to realize that the news is being manipulated by the corporate bosses, who, periodically come downstairs and try to give him directives on which news to report and which news not to report. And he really just becomes kind of disgusted with the whole situation. And so he ends up having kind of a meltdown on live television one night, and he comes up with the famous line, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." And this sort of sparks an almost kind of evangelical revival among people who are sitting at home in their suburban houses watching TV, and he encourages them to throw their windows open and scream out the window, "I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore." And this kind of release of guttural energy reminds me a lot of Allen Ginsberg's poem "Howl," right? And we do have strains of this in post World War II American culture, which would be represented by people like the beatniks or the hippies, people that were kind of on the margins of society and were rejecting a lot of the mediatized experiences that television was offering or that cinema was offering. There were people that were sort of always trying to find more direct ways of experiencing and being in community with other people. And so Network sort of stages an interesting thought experiment in which, because there are no longer very many like normal or healthy ways to do this, it kind of erupts as an explosion. Okay. So I don't want to ramble too much about this. I'm going to show you the clip. It's about 4 minutes long. And then we will turn to the Michael Wood. Okay.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore. I want you to get up right now. Get up, go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore. Things have got to change.
How many stations does this go out?
67. I know it goes to Louisville and Atlanta. Can't take this anymore. Then we'll figure out what to do about the depression and the inflation and the oil crisis. But first, get up out of your chairs, open the window, stick your head out and yell and say, I'm as mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore.
Who are you talking to, Herb?
CGG, Atlanta.
Are they yelling in Atlanta, Herb?
Are they yelling in Atlanta, Ted? But first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm as Take this anymore.
They're yelling in Baton Rouge.
Get up, get up, get up out of your.
Son of a bitch! We struck the mother lode!
Stick your head out of the window, open it, and stick your head out and keep yelling and yell. I'm as mad as hell. I'm not gonna take this anymore. Just get up from your chairs right now. Go to
Where are
the
you
window.
going? I want to see if anybody's yelling.
Window, open it and stick your head out and yell and keep yelling. I'm. I'm mad as hell. I'm not gonna take it anymore. I'm not gonna take it anymore.
Okay. So Network is a great film. I really encourage you to go watch the whole thing. A couple things I want to point out about that clip. So the older gentleman that we just saw at the end there, who's at home, he's actually one of the big bosses of the network, and he's from a kind of old guard generation that really revered the news and thought that they were providing a really important service, to society, to help democracy's wheels turn. And he's sort of aghast at this explosion of populist rage that gets instigated by his own newscaster. I think he sees it as a kind of a passing away of his version of media. But the younger woman, executive played by Faye Dunaway, she's actually um, keen enough to realize that there's an opportunity here, right? So she actually gets really excited, even though the newscaster has completely broken the rules. She sees it as a business opportunity. And what starts to happen in the kind of latter half of the film is that they just adopt this as a new model of how to kind of win an audience over, right? And so um, I think Marcuse would interpret this along the lines of a Marxist framework, which says that one thing capitalism is really good at is identifying markets and figuring out ways to serve them. And so there's an irony here, right? Which is that even if you are aware of the problems of your contemporary culture and decide to reject the mores or the systems that are controlling your life, the moment you do that, you actually just create a new sort of form of life, which can then be set upon by these corporate mediatized interests, right? So this is, of course, a very bleak interpretation of contemporary life in the United States. You wouldn't necessarily need to agree with it, but I think it's a really interesting take on how difficult it is to break out of this system, right? And even a small act of rebellion, like the Tomkeys saying they don't believe in television, um, is set upon by their own neighbors, right? And not just the neighbors, but the neighbor's child. Like they're getting flack from an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old who sees them almost as class traitors, or that they have kind of betrayed the collective agreement that we all have, which is that we should all kind of establish our sense of reality through mediated images coming through the television or the internet or what have you. Okay, so now I want to turn to Michael Wood's really interesting thinking through of the problems with pity that many of you referenced in our conversation. Okay, and this is from an article called "The Demons of Our Pity," and this is a piece of literary criticism in which he's analyzing the novel Pale Fire. And I know you haven't read this. Another wonderful novel. It's probably one of my five favorite novels of all time. So I would really encourage you to take a look at it some point down the road. But I think that um, his critique of this situation in a family is really relevant, and I think you'll kind of see how it applies. Okay, so Pale Fire is a novel about an English professor who is a poet. And he has a troubled teenage daughter who eventually dies by suicide. And her kind of emotional issues from the parents' perspectives revolve around her lack of success in dating. And Wood, I should also say that that interpretation was mostly accepted by most readers of the novel. But Michael Wood makes an intervention here in which he points out that part of the teenage daughter's problem might be the fact that the parents seemed fixated on her success or lack thereof in dating, her physical appearance. And although they love her very much, this love is expressed mostly through pity. And so Wood is going to analyze how he thinks the novel is actually doing something more interesting, that he says that Nabokov is actually sort of interrogating the dark side of pity. And this idea that pity can have a dark side is something many of you picked up on in Us and Them. So I wanted to just read through this short piece of literary criticism and see if we can make any connections. Okay. So Wood writes, the poem continues with these amazing, beautiful, heartless lines where nature is again blamed for a human addiction to conventions. I should mention the poem that he's referencing here is a poem written by the father of this teenage girl because he's a poet. And still old Pan would call from every painted hill, and still the demons of our pity spoke. Old Pan is ancient sex and modern dating. Everything Hazel, the daughter, is not going to get. No man will want her. No lips would share the lipstick of her smoke. A white scarfed beau would never come for her. She'd never go. A dream of gauze and jasmine to that dance. So she's never going to get dressed up and go to prom, is sort of what this is saying. The cliches suggest that Nabokov knows there is something seriously wrong here. He understands that pity is demonic, a destructive, unwelcome emotion. Shade insists that Hazel was his darling, difficult, morose, but still my darling, and we have no reason to doubt him. So, in other words, the father sincerely loves his daughter. What troubles us, troubles me, is Shade and Sybil's assumption that pity in this case, however unwelcome, is unquestionably the right emotion, entirely grounded what anyone would feel. They cannot keep their pity out of their love. Keep it, their language suggests, from swamping their love. When Shade says of Hazel, and these are his last words about her before he recounts the night of her suicide, I think she always nursed a small mad hope. The hope in question is simply, terminally, that a man will desire her. If this were all her hope, to the degree that its dashing was enough to lead her to kill herself, she would surely be more a victim of the manners of her time than anyone has to be or should be. Perhaps her other small mad hope was that her parents would be able to think of something other than her sexual unattractiveness, put it out of their minds, and just love her. Both parents seem, in this respect, like modern sex-ridden variants on the pushy mothers in Jane Austen. Okay, now, um, few things I want to point out here about what Wood is doing. Let me make this smaller. Sorry, folks, just bear with me. Okay. Okay, so a few things I want to point out. Um, Wood locates the problem here, or one of the problems in conventions would be like standard ways of doing things, right? Like acting normal, watching TV, going to prom, all of these things that are laid out for us as life plans that we can either spend our lives trying to fulfill or perhaps feel bad about ourselves for not being able to fulfill them. Um, he calls these things cliches and says that Hazel, the daughter, is a victim of the manners of her time. Now, the manners here would refer to codes of social expectation, how you should act, how you should comport yourself, what you should do. And part of the problem with these cliches and manners and conventions is that we're not totally in control of how other people respond to us, right? So um, the parents feeling okay about their daughter seems to depend upon her fulfilling these expectations. But of course, it's not entirely under her control. People respond to us in ways that are beyond our ability to control. Okay. Um, I also like that he ends this section by saying that we've seen this before, right? In the work of the Victorian novelist Jane Austen, who wrote Pride and Prejudice, and Emma and Northanger Abbey. These novels often feature young female protagonists as they make their way through the dating markets, trying to get married, and encounter all sorts of challenges that are, some of which are under the control and others of which are not. Um, Okay, so we can wrap it up there. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back next week with another lecture. Please check Canvas for updates, and I will be in touch soon. Thank you.